Thumper is an entirely new and unique take on the rhythm game genre. It forgoes the traditional form of gameplay for something more experimental. Steeped in one of the most well-defined and interesting aesthetics, it describes itself as rhythm violence, but you'd be hard-pressed to find a better way to describe it. This theme is then reinforced by hellish and psychedelic visuals that add to the game's brutal intensity rather than distract from its challenging difficulty. Simple as it may seem, even basic levels shoot your heart rate through the roof and feel like a massive undertaking. Honestly, there's so much to unpack about this game that I don't even know where to start. But once again, let's begin with how it all came to be. In 2008, Brian Gibson was working as an effects artist at Harmonix, and had been for years. You may also know him as the bassist from the noise rock band Lightning Bolt. Seriously, check them out, they're one of my favorite musical projects in recent years. While at Harmonix, he worked on games like Guitar Hero and Rock Band, but was starting to feel the itch to work on a more personal project in his free time. Along with the help of a friend, Matt Brinkman, they started developing some ideas and concept art. From the beginning, it was always going to be some type of rhythm game, and the basic idea was relatively common. Notes would come down a track that you would have to interact with in time to some music. The twist was that there would be a grid that you would have to move around, lined with spots that you would have to hit the beat to, making 90-degree turns to stay on the track, all while avoiding a variety of enemies. They also designed some possible characters for the game, including the Space Beetle, which was a result of multiple factors. They wanted something easy to track, something low to the ground so that you could see over it and see what was coming towards you, something that was circular because it would make it easier to see the center of gravity, and most importantly, something unique and non-generic. They also designed the main villain of the game, whom they named Crackhead. Amazing. After about a year of light brainstorming, Matt fell off and Brian was beginning to look for a programmer that would be as enthusiastic about this project as he was. He ended up pitching the idea to a fellow coworker, one that he didn't really know too well from a completely separate team in the company, Mark Fleury. Thankfully, Mark was immediately on board, and together they formed the development team they would call Drool. They were definitely a ragtag team of amateurs in the beginning. Even though both of them had a few years of game industry experience under their belt at this point, that was all working under a large company that handed them down smaller tasks. Brian had never attempted to fully direct the art, music, and sound effects for a whole game, and Mark had little experience working on actual gameplay since most of what he did at Harmonix was just menu and UI programming. He even states that his first time ever writing shader code was for Thumper, which is truly impressive considering that he eventually went on to write his own game engine from the ground up for the project. Once Mark got involved, most of his early work was just getting a bare-bones prototype up and running, acting more as a proof of concept rather than a real basis for the game. But at some point, they both asked each other if this initial idea was interesting, and more importantly, if it would be intriguing enough for players to want to play for hours. Realizing that it may not be, they decided to abandon the idea of the grid and focus on one aspect that they felt could be the game's strong suit: going fast. They also decided to try and make the game feel more like a general action game, rather than strictly a rhythm game. This was helped by making the timing window very wide so as to not have the player focus too much on accuracy. Between all of this, the game went through plenty of iterations, showing an evolution in both the game's direction and Mark's development abilities. For a while, they fell into a pitfall of showing the game off to fellow industry peers and getting feedback that showed a lack of understanding for their vision. This was their quote-unquote wilderness period, as Mark states, a time he actually looks back fondly on since he was still excited by how they felt as a team, doing whatever they wanted, even if other people couldn't see what they saw. But eventually, once they fine-tuned the game's visuals, it felt better, and they were more confident about its direction. Once the work became more serious, Mark ended up quitting his job at Harmonix, going full-time on the project, and moving to Korea with his wife in 2011. This created some problems though, as this forced the team to work completely remotely from each other. However, Mark was able to remedy this situation with some clever tweaks to their editor that made their workflow function better as they were apart. Seriously, he put a lot of effort into their dev tools. If you want to hear Mark talk more about the technical aspect of the game, I highly recommend you check out his post-mortem talk he did at GDC. He goes into a lot of detail about the game's graphics, how he handled memory allocation, his rejection of using object-oriented programming. It's super interesting. Near the end of development, Mark was also starting to buy into the hype behind VR. And while his limited initial experiences were mostly negative, or at the very least, not very encouraging, he eventually felt like it might be a good system for Thumper to work within. This was not without struggle though, as VR introduced a handful of problems that required some interesting solutions, mostly when it came to the perspective of the player. Lacking any real QA team, they simply outsourced their playtesters to just friends that would be willing to try it out, of which interestingly includes Bennett Foddy of Getting Over It fame. For some reason that feels like it makes a lot of sense. And after some time of going to plenty of game festivals and even snagging some award nominations and wins, Thumper was finally released on October 10th of 2016 for PC, PlayStation 4, and PlayStation VR after 7 years of development. Now let's talk about the actual game. You play as a shielded space beetle, traveling through time and space down a single lane, facing off against an abundance of obstacles. You must traverse through 9 levels, each separated out into multiple sub-level checkpoints, with plenty of boss fights along the way. But this game is very unforgiving. You are only ever allowed to mess up once before you lose your shield. And if you mess up again before regenerating your shield, you will die, forcing you back to your last checkpoint. Some sub-levels are short, making this a relatively forgettable punishment. But as you go deeper into the game, time between checkpoints can span many minutes, making that death screen more infuriating each time. To quote Mark, this is not rhythm heaven, it's rhythm hell. By the way, you should definitely check out the last video I did on rhythm heaven. The controls are about as simple as they get. 1 button and 1 stick. Or, if you're playing on keyboard, the spacebar and the arrow keys. While there may only be a handful of interactions the game includes with those limited controls, the variety of ways it throws them at you is vast. To start, the simple thump. Represented by a lit square that travels down the lane, all this requires is a well-timed button press. The more thumps you hit without missing increases your score multiplier to 2x and then even 3x, granting you more points as you go along. Next, you are introduced to turns, in which you must turn left or right to bank off of walls. Most are very short, but occasionally they can be long, requiring you to hold on or survive. This is the only part of the game that includes a level of accuracy, as turns can be performed either nonchalantly or precisely, depending on how well you time them. Then, there are red bars that lay on the floor of the track, and can be broken through by holding down the button and sliding. Lastly, the game adds a level of verticality by introducing jumping, in which you must hold up at the same time as thumping. This will put you into a flying state, mostly to avoid spikes, as well as to break through blue rings that float above the track. But this also leads into another aspect of the game, pounding. This is where you can come back to the ground by pressing down on a thump. Pounding is key because if your streak multiplier is higher than 1x, it will transform an upcoming thump into a bonus thump, which can do a few things for you. Firstly, it can regenerate your shield, which is absolutely necessary during long sub-levels in which it's very hard to not take damage. And secondly, you will be granted bonus points. Bonus thumps also exist at other points in the game, like checkpoints and boss fights. The only other things the game adds later on are multiple lanes, mostly to avoid enemy snakes, and laser sentries, which will hurt you for missing thumps. But other than all of that, that's the whole game. While altogether it may seem like a lot, much of Thumper's difficulty comes from how hard you want to make it on yourself. In reality, half of the game's interactions are completely unnecessary. Unless you are faced with spikes, you literally never need to fly. If you don't want to turn perfectly, you could just hold down the direction way in advance. Pounding is legitimately only necessary when breaking down boss shields. Hell, you don't ever even need to thump, unless it's mandated by either a boss battle or a laser sentry. But even then, you could just take the hit and move on. Clearing Thumper is not a challenge, but what drives you to want to do more is the scoring system. No one really wants to get all the way to the end of the game knowing that they are only ever getting a C rank on every level. Alright, well, how can I get an S rank? Go for the perfect turns. Break through every bar and ring. Attempt to never take damage. Don't miss a single thump. Create as many bonus thumps as possible. Even go for what the game calls kills, where pounding down will destroy oncoming tentacles that line the track. All of these things will reward you with more points, and a lot of the time there is real strategy involved as to when to go for more and when to put the brakes on. Thumper further encourages this type of play by making all of these interactions feel so satisfying. Thumps are emphasized by these deep, full bass hits. Breaking through bars and rings adds even more driving percussion to the music being played. Performing a perfect turn plays this oh-so-sweet sound effect that never gets old. And pounding down over and over creates these intensifying thuds that force the music to stop for a beat. At the end of the day, Thumper only has one set difficulty, and yet it has found the most creative way to encourage the player to make it harder on themselves in the most satisfying manner, which is truly something I have yet to see in any other rhythm game. Aside from just the gameplay, Thumper brings so much to the table in terms of music. First and foremost, instead of just playing in time with the rhythm, you are rather creating the rhythm on top of the soundtrack, which feels so much more immersive. And when it comes to the soundtrack itself, it is so different than anything you could expect. Sure, they could have had every single sub-level be a new song, much like your average rhythm game. But instead, it feels like the entire game is just one continuous anthem that builds and builds and builds, set in this style that feels almost uncategorizable. And this was intentional, since Brian states that he wanted the music for the game to feel so different that no one would really be put off by its sound. It's filled with the most intense, percussion-based atmospheric music one could find, mixed together with these extremely grand brass sections that pop in from time to time, straight out of The Shining. It all evokes such a zen feeling that I would almost encourage people to just take some time out and finish it all in one sitting. Plus, as a bonus Easter egg, some people have even speculated that each level has its own corresponding time signature, which Brian himself has even confirmed. Brian also made a Spotify playlist of some of his musical influences for the project, which I highly recommend you check out. In terms of the visuals, there really isn't much to say, but rather just stare in awe. The main character, a space beetle, is so perfectly organic in its shape, yet terrifyingly mechanical at the same time. This is then starkly contrasted against the sharp and rigid enemies that you encounter. The colors are dark and eerie, yet beautifully saturated with gradations that feel so weirdly comforting. The animations for the tentacles that line the track are stunning, all performing a dance that tricks you into a false sense of security. And the way in which Crackhead gets more and more vicious as the game progresses is just so cool. To quote this review from Eurogamer, it is almost Cthulhian, one of clean horror. And many people do indeed describe this game as horror, as it is one that toes that line. From the developers themselves, Mark says that they wanted the game's aesthetic to be psychedelic, but not light and dreamy, but rather hard psych, likening it to that of the monolith from 2001: A Space Odyssey. Somehow, in its simple and clean geometry, it's able to evoke this mysterious feeling. Aside from all that, there are a few gripes that I feel like are worth mentioning. Most notably, sometimes when things come down the track, they are genuinely too hard to see and read. The audio cues for these are good, but sometimes they can get drowned out by the loud music, making a missed turn feel like less than your own fault. Also, if I'm being completely honest, I don't feel like playing in VR adds too much to the experience except bringing you a little closer to the action, which already doesn't really feel necessary. The only time I feel like the effect of VR is worth it is during the boss battles, wherein they actually did size up the enemies to a massive and grandiose scale that requires you to look up. Plus, one neat trick to playing in VR is starting the game while sitting and then standing. This can give you a slightly better vantage point to see what is coming down the track. However, I would not actually recommend playing the entire game this way. And finally, spoiler alert, we have to talk about the last level of the game, which has been controversial amongst fans. It throws everything you learned out the window and essentially forces you to memorize seemingly random speed variations, playing through by trial and error until you just miraculously do it. On the one hand, I think having all of your previous experience turned on its head for the final moment of a game is usually super cool. However, in a rhythm game like this, where everything is relatively strict in both its timing and anticipation, this comes off as a bit of a spit in the face after working so hard to get to this point. Nonetheless, the satisfaction of beating this game is still great. After all 9 levels have been completed, you can go back and try to complete Play Plus mode, in which the game goes even faster, your score multiplier can go up to 4x, there is an extra S plus ranking, the beetle is now golden, and most importantly, death means complete failure, and kicks you all the way back to the beginning of the level. And if all of that isn't difficult enough for you, there's actually a pretty decent modding community for the game, and boy does it go hard. As for the future, unfortunately, neither Mark nor Brian are looking to make another rhythm game for the time being, let alone a sequel to Thumper. Which is fair, considering they have been making rhythm games for a long time now. Well, what else is there really to say? They made some pretty cool merch for the game, including some t-shirts, a beetle pin, a limited edition box set, and even the soundtrack on vinyl. Really wish I knew about that before it sold out. Honestly, just go play this game, it's so good. I've played through the entire thing nearly 3 times now, and I'd probably do it all again. Plus, it's been ported to nearly every platform imaginable. They even made a mobile version of the game, which on the one hand seems super cool, but on the other hand seems like it'd be an absolute nightmare trying to do precise inputs on a touchscreen. But I digress. So what do you think of Thumper? Is it one of the most unique rhythm games in recent years, or does all of this just seem like a crazy fever dream? Either way, I'll be sure to catch you in the next video.